Welcome to the program, Ambassador Quarrey.
Thanks very much for having me.
I would like to start with the Western support for Ukraine, as the US military support for Ukraine has been suspended. Are Western allies ready to compensate Ukraine the lack of the US support?
Well, we very much hope that US support will continue. They provided great leadership so far alongside the UK and others in Europe. We are very much hoping that the supplemental bill will get through the US Congress as quickly as possible, because we think this needs to continue to be a collective effort between the US and its European partners. The UK and others will continue increasing our support to Ukraine wherever we can, but it's really important for us that the US be part of that picture.
But how does this decision influence the position on support for Ukraine from other NATO allies?
Well, we saw the EU's decision recently to get their 50 billion euros through. Our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was in Kyiv with President Zelensky, and he confirmed our support for this financial year at £2.5 billion, the most we've ever done. So I hear a lot of commitment from NATO allies and other partners at the moment to continue supporting Ukraine, but we hope the US will get their supplemental through so that they can continue providing the extraordinary support that they have.
Is it possible to say that Western support for Ukraine is wavering, if it is possible to compare the situation a year ago, for example?
I don't think so. And when I look at where we were 2 years ago when Putin launched his full-scale invasion, and I see how much support has been provided from Europe, from the United States, I consistently hear a message here at NATO of continuing determination to support Ukraine. It is harder sometimes to find the ammunition because we have provided so much already. We have drawn down many of our national stockpiles to help support Ukraine. But I feel that the political commitment to be with Ukraine through to victory is still very much evident.
You mentioned about stockpiles of ammunition. Is there a plan to increase production of ammunition, and do you believe that it would be possible for Europe to really increase the production from ammunition and make it possible to help Ukraine with artillery shells?
So last year at NATO's Vilnius summit, we agreed the Defence Production Action Plan, which is precisely aimed at helping all allies boost their industrial capacity. Because we've all learned some very hard lessons from the terrible conflict in Ukraine, that we have allowed our national stockpiles to go perhaps lower than they should have, and that we've allowed our defence industrial base to reduce beyond what it should have. So we've got a lot of work going underway at the moment, both to make sure that we can support ourselves and our own defence, but also so that we can continue supporting Ukraine well into the future. Because one of the critical things is that Vladimir Putin understands that not only is the West determined to continue supporting Ukraine, but that we have the means to continue doing so, including through strengthening our industrial base. We've had British companies recently in Ukraine, BAE Systems, Babcock and others, who are looking at rebuilding their presence on the ground in Ukraine to support Ukraine's own defence industrial base.
Do you feel that there is a willingness to support Ukraine until the very end of this fight, also in terms of political support and military one?
I think so, yes. And one of the things that I'm very proud of in the UK is that we have very strong support for Ukraine across the political spectrum. There is bipartisan support in our parliament for Ukraine and a determination within the country as a whole to continue supporting Ukraine. But I feel that here at NATO as well. I think people at NATO understand that not only is Ukraine fighting for its own freedom and sovereignty and territorial integrity, but Ukraine is also fighting for European security. So I think there is a real determination and resolve to be with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Also, Ukraine and the United Kingdom have signed a treaty on security guarantees. From your perspective, what are the most significant provisions of this treaty which can really make difference in Ukraine?
So we were very proud to be the first G7 country to sign our bilateral security agreement with Ukraine, just as we were the first country to provide lethal aid to Ukraine back after the full-scale invasion. And it is deliberately a very comprehensive and broad-based agreement. But there are important clauses in there about the UK coming to Ukraine's assistance in any future crisis, but also lots about building our cooperation on things like defence industrial, on cyber, also on the economy and reconstruction. And in it, we signal our desire to build a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. And as far as I know, we have no other 100-year partnerships around the world. So that says something about the strength and depth of the UK's commitment to Ukraine.
You mentioned about partnership, but is the UK government ready to take a leading role in supporting Ukraine in case of a dramatic U-turn in the foreign policy of the United States?
Well, as I said earlier, we hope that US support will continue. I expect that it will. But all of us need to continue stepping up, both in terms of quantity and quality, because it's going to be another tough year on the battlefield. We appreciate what an awful conflict this is for the people of Ukraine. But our responsibility and our commitment as the UK is to continue supporting Ukraine through to victory.
In your opinion, what should be the NATO's message to Russian President Putin, who hopes to have a war of attrition?
I think our message to President Putin should be that we are both politically committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, and that we have the means to do so. We have the means to help Ukraine prevail in this struggle, because he feels that he can outlast the West in our support for Ukraine, and he is fundamentally wrong about that.
Do you believe that this political and military message could change his mind, change his calculus?
It is very hard to say. And President Putin has the means to end this conflict tomorrow if he chose to do so. He could do that by withdrawing Russian forces from Ukraine. It is really in his hands. But in the meantime, our responsibility is to show him that we are with Ukraine for as long as it takes, because we think ultimately that is the best way to change his mind and to get to an acceptable outcome.
But does the West use enough tools to persuade him to end the war in Ukraine?
Well, we have imposed the most swingeing sanctions on Ukraine that I have seen, I think probably in my diplomatic career. We have put a lot of pressure on the Russian economy. Europe has taken very important decisions about reducing its dependence on Russian hydrocarbons. And I think it is now a measure of desperation for Russia that Putin is having to pursue these partnerships with North Korea, with Iran. This is not a signal of strength from Russia. This is a sign of its weakness.
I would like also to cover the work of NATO-Ukraine Council. In your opinion, what are the biggest achievements of this council since it has been established?
Well, we really welcomed the establishment of the NATO-Ukraine Council at the Vilnius summit last year. It has met several times already, including meeting quickly after there have been some terrible attacks by the Russians on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, for example. So I think we are already showing through the Council that it can be responsive to Ukrainian concerns. But there's lots of important work that is being done, overseen by the Council, supporting Ukraine's reform efforts, helping direct support for Ukraine's defence industrial base, and then the main point of it really is that we are bringing Ukraine ever closer to NATO. And that is both an important signal that the creation of the Council sent, but all the practical work that the Council oversees is all aimed at helping make Ukraine ever more interoperable with NATO, bringing Ukrainian military up to NATO standards, helping support defence reform in Ukraine, and as I say, overall, just bringing Ukraine ever closer to NATO.
What do you personally expect from the upcoming NATO-Ukraine Council meeting?
Well, so we have the NATO-Ukraine Council meeting at defence ministerial level here this week. And there I expect a full discussion about the situation on the battlefield, about what Ukrainian needs are at the moment, where Ukraine needs additional support, and how allies can continue to provide that. And also, I think ministers will be looking ahead to 2024 and starting to shape some of the outcomes of the Washington summit in July.
In your opinion, could the work of NATO-Ukraine Council really dramatically change the situation in Ukraine, really make a difference, for example, on the ground?
I think it'll be a contribution to the overall Allied effort. I don't think in itself that the Council will fundamentally change the situation on the battlefield. But I think it's important both in terms of the substance of what it delivers and that political message that we are serious about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO and that is getting closer all the time, we hope.
I would like also to cover the upcoming NATO summit in Washington. Are there any negotiations among NATO members on any kind of decision on Ukraine's pathway to membership in NATO?
Well, we're still about 5 months out from the Washington summit, so preparatory work is starting now, but we're not quite yet in the detail of the negotiations of the summit outcome. But what is very clear is that Ukraine and NATO's continuing support to Ukraine will be at the very top of NATO's agenda when our leaders meet together in Washington in July.
What is this preparation work focused on from the side of the UK government?
Well, from our point of view, from the UK, we would like to see NATO doing ever more to support Ukraine. We would like to see NATO bringing Ukraine ever closer. And we have a number of programs working with Ukraine to support defense industry, to support the Ukrainian effort. And we want to see that work progressing and to be building out the relationship between NATO and Ukraine in very practical areas that help Ukraine not only in the short term while the conflict is running, but also that look ahead to the future when we expect Ukraine to become a full member of the alliance.
Should Ukrainians expect any kind of breakthrough on Ukraine's pathway to membership in NATO this year?
Well, if, as I assume is unfortunately likely to be the case, the conflict is still running very hot on the ground in July, then I doubt we will see a big step forward, because I think allies understand that we can't offer an invitation while the conflict is still very live in Ukraine. But we want to signal that membership path is getting shorter, that Ukraine is getting closer to the alliance, and also that NATO is doing more practically to support Ukraine through this terrible conflict.
Are there any options for Ukraine to become a NATO member even in the middle of the war?
I think that would be very difficult while the conflict is going on, while the war is going on. But
what are the biggest challenges for this, for example?
Because you could then expand the conflict to become one between Russia and NATO, which I think would be something we would all seriously want to avoid. But that doesn't diminish in any way our determination that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, that we want Ukraine in the NATO alliance. Our Prime Minister has talked about Ukraine's rightful place being in the alliance. And we see our bilateral security agreement with Ukraine as being another step toward Ukrainian membership of the alliance. It's just very difficult while the conflict is raging as it is on the ground at the moment, unfortunately.
Also, US Ambassador to NATO, Gillian Smith, said that she would not expect Ukraine to be invited to join NATO at the upcoming NATO summit in Washington. What is your take on this matter?
What's to say? Last year at Vilnius, allies were very clear that a membership invitation will be extended when allies agree and when the conditions are met. It is not clear that conditions can be met this year at the Washington summit. But what we must not do is become so focused on that one point about membership that we ignore all the other really positive things that are happening between Ukraine and NATO at the moment. I completely understand why people in Ukraine feel very strongly about this, but our message is that Ukraine is getting ever closer to NATO, and NATO is doing ever more practically to support Ukraine, both in this immediate conflict and for the longer term.
How do you see the NATO's further steps in enhancing cooperation with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine's war effort?
I think there will be a number of important areas where that work can be enhanced. As I've mentioned, defence industrial cooperation is a very high priority. I think supporting the development of Ukraine's defence institutions. And a particularly important strand is Ukraine continuing to pursue reform of its defence structures. Now, we understand this is very hard to do during the middle of a hot conflict, and I think Ukraine deserves a lot of credit for the way that it is continuing to do that. But all of that work ultimately shortens the path to NATO membership for Ukraine.
Could Ukraine also expect any kind of major decisions on security assistance from the United Kingdom?
Well, I think we've now got our bilateral security agreement that has been signed, the first of any country to do so. The Prime Minister has confirmed that we will be contributing around £2.5 billion sterling for security assistance this year. I think all of the details of that are being worked through now. So I think we've probably made our big announcements for this year in terms of our support to Ukraine. But for the UK, it remains incredibly important that we continue to be one of Ukraine's strongest and most reliable partners.
I would like also to ask you about the public support for aiding Ukraine in the United Kingdom. Do you feel any kind of war fatigue in the UK? And is the public opinion still supporting Ukraine and providing Ukraine with military aid?
I'm very proud of the fact that the UK public continues to be very strong and resolute in its support for Ukraine. And that support we see in the opinion polls continues to be really high. I think people in the UK really understand what this conflict is about, that this is about Ukraine fighting for its freedom, its values, its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And that in doing so, it is fighting for all European values. So I think people in the UK really understand the clarity of the moral case for supporting Ukraine, and that's why we have such continuing strong support from the UK.
Is it because of the UK's history of the war?
I think there is something in that people understand in the UK what it's like to stand alone sometimes and to be fighting really for everything that your country holds dear, both in terms of its political integrity, but also for the values that it represents. And many people in the UK look back to 1940, when effectively the UK was standing alone against tyranny in Europe, and they see something very similar for Ukraine, I think, at the moment.
Could the UK government influence also public opinion on supporting Ukraine in the allied countries, and how could the UK government influence the position of other allies on supporting Ukraine?
Well, I think we have felt right from the very start of this conflict that it's been important for the UK to show leadership and to show not only is it the right thing for all of us to do in terms of supporting Ukraine, but also that this is a practical thing, that we can do this, that Ukraine can prevail in this conflict, and that we have the tools in the West and with partners around the world to help Ukraine do so. So I think we've got to show continuing moral and political leadership, but most importantly, we show a continuing belief that Ukraine can win this conflict, but also that we can give you the means to do so. And I think we've just got to keep reminding ourselves that yours is the right cause in Ukraine and it is the right thing to do to continue supporting you, but also that it is practically achievable as well.
Also, I would like to cover possible negotiations with Russia. Is there any kind of pressure on Ukraine to negotiate with Russia at this stage?
There is no pressure on Ukraine to negotiate with Russia at this point, and I don't expect there to be pressure on Ukraine in the future. This has to be a sovereign Ukrainian decision. We all hope that there can be a negotiated end to this conflict at some point, but that is a decision for Ukrainians and for Ukrainians only, both the timing of those negotiations and the content, because it is Ukraine's freedom that is at stake here. It is Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and it must not be for any of us outside to be putting pressure on Ukraine to say you must negotiate now, or you must do it then, or that you must negotiate on these terms. The Russians have repeatedly tried to spin this story that near the start of the conflict, Western allies somehow stopped Ukraine from negotiating. It is complete nonsense that that happened then. That was a Ukrainian decision, and we stood by that Ukrainian decision, just as we stand by Ukraine now.
Is there any decision on any discussions on pressuring Ukraine to negotiate with Russia among other NATO allies? Did you hear such discussions?
I don't hear that at all here at NATO headquarters. What I do hear is a continuing, very strong commitment to continue supporting Ukraine, to be doing even more to help Ukraine prevail in this conflict. But I have not heard anybody here say, that now is the time to start pressuring Ukraine on this. It would just be wrong to do so.
As Ukrainians face such a grim, also difficult situation on the ground and around the country, what is your personal message to the Ukrainian nation during these hard times?
Well, we understand that it is an incredibly difficult time for Ukraine at the moment, and I fear that 2024 will be another difficult year. But my message to Ukraine on behalf of the United Kingdom is that we were with Ukraine before Putin's full-scale invasion. We were supporting Ukraine from 2014 onwards with military training and equipment. We've been with Ukraine since the 24th of February 2022, and we will be with Ukraine until victory and beyond. That's why our Prime Minister is interested in this 100-year partnership, because he wants to signal that we are with Ukraine all the way in this.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.
Thank you.